From a distance, the empire looks unbreakable. Istanbul rises from the water like a crown, its skyline cut by minarets and domes that have watched centuries pass. The Bosphorus is alive with movement. Warships glide between continents. Merchant vessels crowd the strait, carrying grain, textiles, and silver between worlds. In the palace, sultans rule over lands stretching from the Balkans to the deserts of Arabia. This is how power is usually remembered: visible, solid, commanding. History books often tell the same simple story. The Ottoman Empire grew old. It fell behind. Corruption rotted it from within. And eventually, it collapsed under its own weight. That explanation is neat. It is also incomplete, because long before borders were redrawn by generals and treaties, they were rewritten somewhere far quieter, in offices without flags, in rooms without armies, in ledgers filled with numbers instead of names. This is not a story of sudden defeat. There is no single battle that explains it, no dramatic moment where everything collapses at once. Instead, this is a story of slow erosion, of power drained patiently, legally, and almost politely. While the empire focused on holding territory, another power focused on holding accounts. While Ottoman officials worried about rebellions and rival states, foreign financiers worried about interest rates and guarantees. British influence did not arrive on warships at first. It arrived in contracts. Loans came framed as help, not control, as opportunity, not surrender. They look like lifelines. But lifelines can also become restraints. Interest hid behind respectful language and diplomatic smiles. Think about that. An empire that survived centuries of war began to lose its future not on the battlefield, but in counting houses and foreign offices. At first glance, borrowing seemed harmless, even sensible. Europe was changing fast. Industrialization demanded capital. Railways, ports, factories, and modern armies all required money on a scale older systems could not easily provide. The Ottoman state faced rising costs and shrinking margins. Wars were expensive. Administration over vast lands was expensive. Reform was expensive. European banks had deep pockets and long memories. They offered funds with confidence, backed by the growing power of industrial economies. The empire accepted. Why wouldn't it? Borrowing was normal. States across Europe did it. Debt did not look like weakness. It looked like modernization. It looked like survival. But debt is not neutral. It always comes with expectations. And when payments are late, expectations turn into demands. Slowly, almost invisibly, financial obligations began to shape political choices. Revenue streams were identified, then earmarked. Customs duties, monopolies on salt and tobacco, fees collected at ports that once symbolized sovereignty. These were pledged as guarantees, often before the money was even collected. Control over income became control over policy. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to matter, just enough to shift leverage. An empire that commanded armies now had to ask permission from creditors, not openly, not officially, but in practice. The stakes behind this quiet transformation were enormous. The Ottoman lands were not just territory. They were crossroads, trade routes linking Europe to Asia, ports connecting global markets, regions rich in resources that were only beginning to reveal their full value. Oil was not yet the prize it would become, but the ground beneath the Middle East already mattered. Whoever influenced these lands influenced trade, security, and future wealth. Britain understood this. It did not need to conquer the region outright. Influence achieved through finance was cheaper, safer, and more durable. Military occupation ends. Financial dependence lingers. Think about the efficiency of that. Power without the burden of direct rule. Inside the empire, the danger was hard to see. There were no foreign flags over ministries, no occupying armies in the streets. Ottoman officials still signed decrees. Courts still functioned. Taxes were still collected. On the surface, sovereignty remained intact. But beneath that surface, the margin for independent action shrank. Decisions that once belonged entirely to the state were now constrained by obligations to outsiders. Could taxes be raised without upsetting creditors? Could tariffs be adjusted without violating agreements? Could resources be redirected to emergencies without missing payments? Each question narrowed the field of possible action. This is how control works when it is exercised quietly. It does not announce itself. It limits options until obedience feels like choice. The empire had faced external threats before. Crusades, invasions, coalitions of rival powers. It survived them all by adapting, fighting, and negotiating from a position of strength. This threat was different. It did not demand surrender. It demanded punctuality. It did not seek glory. It sought predictability. The battlefield was no longer a field at all. It was a balance sheet. Columns of numbers replaced formations of soldiers. Missed payments mattered more than lost skirmishes. Credit ratings mattered more than morale. Victory was no longer measured by territory held, but by accounts settled on time. Imagine the contrast. In one room, generals study maps, planning troop movements and fortifications. In another, far away, clerks review ledgers, calculating interest and risk. The second room begins to matter more than the first, because when the money tightens, armies stall. When revenues are pledged, flexibility disappears. When creditors lose confidence, pressure mounts. Not through cannons, but through conditions. This is power exercised at a distance. Clean hands, Clear contracts. No blood on the paper. The most dangerous part of this process is how reasonable it feels while it unfolds. Each loan solves an immediate problem. Each agreement buys time. Each concession seems temporary. The future cost is abstract, distant, easy to ignore when the present is burning. The empire told itself it was managing risk, that it was catching up, that it remained in control. After all, the documents were signed voluntarily. No one forced a pen to move. But choice under pressure is not the same as freedom. And repeated compromises, even small ones, add up. This is where the familiar story begins to break down. Decline was not just cultural or military. It was structural. Financial dependence reshaped the empire from the inside out. It altered incentives. It shifted priorities. It rewarded stability for creditors over resilience for citizens. Over time, servicing debt became a central function of the state. Governance bent around repayment. The empire did not fall because it forgot how to fight. It faltered because it lost control over its own economic lifeblood. The central question, then, is not why the empire eventually collapsed. It is how it lost leverage long before collapse became visible. How does a state with armies, territory, and history surrender power without losing a single major battle first? How does sovereignty erode without a declaration of defeat? The answer lies in understanding debt not as a financial detail, but as a strategic weapon, one that works slowly, one that leaves buildings standing and flags flying, one that makes domination look like cooperation. By the time the consequences became clear, options were limited. Obligations could not be wished away. Revenues could not be reclaimed easily. Foreign oversight, once accepted as assistance, became entrenched. The empire was still standing, but it was no longer fully steering itself. And that distinction matters, because when the next crisis arrived, the empire would face them with fewer tools, less freedom, and growing dependence on those who now held the books. This story begins here, not at the moment of collapse, but at the moment control quietly shifted, in the glow of palace lights and the calm of diplomatic meetings, in the belief that money could buy time. It did, but time came at a price. And that price would shape the fate of an empire in a region long after the final payments were made. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire looked like permanence carved into stone. Its cities pulsed with life and movement. Markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents. Caravans arrived from the east. Ships departed westward, heavy with cargo and promise. Istanbul was not merely a seat of power. It was a hinge of the world. Whoever passed through it touched Europe, Asia, and Africa at once. Customs houses collected revenue from every direction. Ports thrived. Guilds flourished. On the surface, this was an empire that understood trade, money, and administration. It had outlasted rivals that once seemed just as strong. To many observers, there was no reason to believe it could not adapt again. The state's control over key routes created a powerful illusion of security. Choke points meant leverage. The empire could tax goods moving between seas. It could regulate access. It could reward loyalty and punish defiance through commerce. These were not the tools of a declining power. They were the tools of a confident one. Even as Europe industrialized, the Ottomans still sat at the center of global exchange. Grain flowed out. Manufactured goods flowed in. Silver and gold circulated through imperial markets. The system appeared balanced. And for a time, it was this visibility of strength masked deeper changes unfolding beyond the empire's control. Modernization arrived dressed as necessity. The world was moving faster. Armies were growing larger and more expensive. Communication demanded speed. Railways promised to bind provinces together. Telegraph lines promised control across distance. Factories promised self-sufficiency. Reform was not optional. It was survival. The empire's leadership understood this. They spoke the language of progress. They announced new projects, new ministries, new systems meant to rival those of Europe. From the outside, it looked like momentum. From the inside, it felt like a race against time. Foreign advisors became common sights in imperial halls. They walked beneath chandeliers and along marble corridors, offering expertise and reassurance. Their presence was framed as partnership, knowledge transfer, technical assistance. They praised ambition. They applauded reform. And quietly, they negotiated terms. The empire still signed its own documents. It still issued its own decrees. Sovereignty appeared intact. But the logic guiding decisions began to shift. Projects were evaluated not only for their benefit to the state, but for their acceptability to lenders. Progress was filtered through creditworthiness. Borrowing, in this context, seemed rational. Europe had capital, vast pools of it. Banks fueled by industrial growth needed places to invest. States were safe borrowers, or so it appeared. The Ottoman Empire had territory, people, and revenue. It had survived centuries of turmoil. Why would it default? From the imperial perspective, loans offered breathing room. They allowed reforms to proceed without immediate sacrifice. Taxes did not have to rise sharply. Unrest could be postponed. Stability could be maintained. Money, it seemed, could buy time. Imagine the decision-makers at the center of the system. Maps spread across tables. Reports stacked high. Pressure from every direction. Provinces demanding investment. Armies demanding resources. Citizens demanding relief. In that moment, a loan does not feel like surrender. It feels like a tool. Temporary. manageable, necessary. Each agreement is justified by the belief that future growth will cover future costs, that modernization will pay for itself, that the empire will emerge stronger and more competitive. This belief is powerful. It is also dangerous, because every loan carried conditions, whether explicit or implied. Guarantees were required. Revenues were identified as collateral, not abstract future income, but specific, reliable streams. Customs duties, state monopolies, taxes on everyday goods. These were not theoretical promises. They were concrete claims. Money that once flowed directly into imperial coffers was now earmarked. Before it could serve the state, it had to satisfy creditors. This shift mattered more than it appeared at first. The empire began to modernize, but it did so on rented terms. Railways were built, but ownership and control often rested elsewhere. Ports expanded, but access was shaped by foreign interests. Infrastructure tied the empire more tightly to global markets, yet those markets were not neutral. They were dominated by industrial powers with their own priorities. The empire gained connectivity, but lost autonomy. It became more efficient, but less flexible. This is the paradox of debt-driven modernization. To the outside world, the illusion held. Flags still flew. Laws were still issued in the name of the state. Diplomats spoke of equality and respect. There was no announcement that control had shifted. That was the point. Power does not need spectacle when it has structure. The empire reassured itself that it remained in charge. After all, it could still say no. In theory. In practice, saying no became harder with each obligation added to the ledger. The true danger was cumulative. One loan alone does not trap a state. One concession does not erase sovereignty. But patterns form. Payments come due. Unexpected costs arise. Wars flare. Crops fail. Revenues dip. When that happens, the answer is often another loan. Cover the gap. Smooth the shock. Keep the system running. Each new agreement references the last. Interest compounds. Timelines extend. What began as short-term assistance turns into long-term dependence. This dependence reshaped priorities within the state. Servicing debt became a central concern. Stability for creditors outweighed reform for citizens. Policies were designed to reassure markets rather than empower populations. The empire did not announce this shift. It absorbed it quietly. Ministries adjusted. Budgets tightened. Certain revenues were treated as untouchable, not because they served the public, but because they secured confidence abroad. Economic life bent around repayment schedules. There's a particular kind of blindness that comes with gradual change. When transformation happens slowly, it feels normal. Each step is small enough to justify. Each compromise seems temporary. Leaders tell themselves that control remains with them because the symbols of control remain visible. But symbols do not pay debts, and symbols do not override contracts. Over time, the empire's room to maneuver narrowed. Choices that once existed no longer did. They were priced out. Think about what it means for a state to lose options. It can still rule, it can still command, but it cannot respond freely. Every decision is filtered through financial consequences. Can troops be moved if it disrupts trade? Can tariffs be raised if it alarms creditors? Can reforms proceed if they threaten repayment? These questions linger behind every policy. Power becomes conditional. Authority becomes negotiated. British influence grew not through declarations, but through this quiet dependency. No need for flags or governors. Influence flowed through agreements that were legally binding and politically discreet. Fine print replaced force. Time replaced violence. The empire was not conquered. It was managed. And management, when external, is a form of control that resists resistance. You cannot easily rebel against a contract. The illusion of strength persisted because collapse had not yet arrived. The trains ran. The ports bustled. The palace still glittered. But beneath that surface, the foundations were shifting. The empire had traded future freedom for present stability. It had accepted a system where survival depended on external confidence. That confidence could be withdrawn. And when it was, the consequences would be severe. This chapter of the story is not about failure. It is about miscalculation, about underestimating how power operates in a financial age. The Ottoman Empire believed it was using debt as a tool. It did not see that debt was using it. Modernization continued. Progress appeared real, but the price of that progress was leverage handed quietly to others. By the time the illusion began to crack, the structure was already in place. Revenue streams were pledged. Oversight was normalized. Dependence was routine. The empire still looked strong, but strength built on borrowed control is fragile. And when pressure finally came, it would reveal just how much power had already slipped away. The cracks did not announce themselves with panic or collapse. They appeared quietly, buried in budgets and correspondence, spreading through ministries like hairline fractures in stone. At first, they were easy to explain away. A bad harvest here, a costly campaign there, temporary disruptions. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. Debt repayments began to consume more attention than governance itself. Money that once funded administration, defense, and reform was redirected toward obligations whose origins were years, sometimes decades, old. The empire was still collecting revenue, but less of it truly belonged to the state. This is where the mechanism of the trap revealed itself. When payments fell behind, Creditors did not immediately demand submission. They offered solutions. New loans to cover old ones. Restructuring agreements framed as relief. Extended timelines that came with new conditions. Interest layered upon interest. Each adjustment made the system more complex and more binding. What looked like flexibility was, in reality, deeper entanglement. The empire was no longer borrowing to grow. It was borrowing to survive. And survival on those terms came at a cost. Foreign creditors began to demand more than punctual payments. Guarantees turned into oversight. Oversight turned into influence. British-backed financial institutions stepped in to stabilize the situation. The language was calm, technical, and reassuring. Stability, confidence, order. But stabilization meant management. And management meant control over key parts of the economy. Revenues were no longer just pledged. They were monitored, collected under supervision, allocated according to agreed priorities. Large portions of the imperial economy were now effectively administered from outside. Think about the leverage this created. Railways determined how quickly troops could move across provinces. Ports determined which goods flowed in and out, and under what terms. Customs offices determined how much income the state could actually use. Control any one of these, and you shape outcomes. Control several, and you shape policy. This was power without uniforms. Authority without occupation. Decisions made in distant rooms echoed across imperial territory, not through commands, but through constraints. The imbalance became clearer as debt service began to outweigh military spending. This was not symbolic. It was practical. Armies require resources, supplies, pay, logistics. When budgets tightened, readiness suffered. When readiness suffered, deterrence weakened. The empire still had soldiers, but its ability to deploy them freely diminished. Military decisions now carried financial consequences that extended beyond strategy. Every movement risked disruption to revenue streams pledged to creditors. War became not just a political gamble, but a financial one with external stakeholders. The turning point came when economic dependence crossed into political obedience. This did not happen through a single decree. It emerged through habit. Officials adjusted policies to avoid friction with creditors. Certain reforms were delayed. Certain taxes were avoided. Certain concessions were renewed, not because they were ideal, but because they were expected. Sovereignty did not vanish. It narrowed. The range of acceptable decisions shrank until independence existed mostly in theory. Crises accelerated the process. Wars erupted. Revolts flared. Global economic shocks rippled through trade networks. In moments like these, a sovereign state needs flexibility. It needs to mobilize resources quickly, to take risks, to absorb short-term pain for long-term stability. The Ottoman Empire found itself unable to do so freely. Its options were already priced, already negotiated, already limited by agreements designed for calmer times. Emergency decisions had to pass through financial filters. That delay was costly. This is what power exercise at a distance looks like. It does not issue commands. It sets boundaries. It does not force compliance. It makes alternatives unaffordable. The empire could still choose, but only within a narrowing corridor defined by debt. Step outside it and consequences followed. Confidence would fall. Credit would dry up. Pressure would mount. The threat was not invasion. It was isolation from capital, trade, and financial legitimacy. Inside the empire, frustration grew. Officials sensed a loss of control, even if they could not always name it. Citizens felt the strain as taxes targeted everyday goods tied to pledged revenues. Economic life bent toward extraction rather than development. Wealth flowed outward to service obligations. While internal needs piled up, the state was caught between maintaining order at home and satisfying demands abroad. Both required money. Only one generated it. The tragedy of this moment lies in its subtlety. There was no dramatic betrayal. No single villain. The system functioned exactly as designed. Contracts were honored. Payments were made when possible. Oversight was justified as protection for investors. And yet, the cumulative effect was devastating. The empire had surrendered the steering wheel while remaining in the driver's seat. It bore responsibility without control, authority without autonomy. By now, the illusion of strength was fraying. The symbols remained, but their meaning had changed. Flags still flew, but decisions increasingly reflected external priorities. Institutions still operated, but within frameworks shaped elsewhere. The empire's future was no longer fully its own to determine. And when the final storms arrived, it would face them constrained, indebted, and exposed. This chapter marks the moment where decline becomes structural. Not inevitable yet, but increasingly likely. The debt trap had closed, not with a snap, but with a tightening grip. The empire could still move, still govern, still fight, but it did so under terms it did not fully control. And in history, that difference often decides who survives and who does not. Collapse rarely looks like collapse while it's happening. It arrives disguised as adjustment, reform, and compromise. In the Ottoman case, the end did not come with a single blow. It came as a chain reaction. Each consequence triggered the next. As financial pressure tightened, political authority weakened. As authority weakened, territories became negotiable. Provinces were no longer governed solely as parts of a sovereign whole. They became assets, liabilities, bargaining chips in a system that now values stability for creditors above cohesion for the state. As the empire struggled to meet its obligations, external powers positioned themselves not merely as lenders, but as managers of risk. The language of diplomacy shifted. Discussions were no longer about partnership alone. They were about guarantees, assurances, and supervision. The empire's weakening finances justified deeper involvement. What began as financial oversight expanded into political influence. Decisions about infrastructure, administration, and security increasingly reflected external priorities. The state still existed, but its center of gravity had moved. Territories on the edges felt the change first. Regions once bound by imperial authority now sensed uncertainty. Investment flowed selectively. Areas tied to trade routes and resources received attention. Others were neglected. Local elites adjusted accordingly, aligning themselves with whoever offered protection or profit. The empire's internal cohesion frayed. Loyalty became conditional. Authority became fragmented. When central power weakens, peripheries drift. Debt accelerated that drift by redirecting attention away from integration and toward extraction. As global conflicts reshaped the political landscape, the empire entered the storm already compromised. Its finances were strained, its autonomy limited, its ability to maneuver constrained by obligations signed years earlier. When war demands flexibility, debt demands discipline. Those two forces collide. Emergency spending becomes difficult. Supply chains falter. Revenues collapse just as needs peak. In this environment, external actors gain leverage not through conquest, but through assistance offered at a price. The post-war order formalized what debt had already begun. Territories were detached under the language of administration and mandate. Borders were proposed, adjusted, and finalized with economic logic in mind. Rail lines that once served imperial integration now marked divisions. Ports that once connected regions now served external trade networks. What looked like political restructuring was also financial settlement. Obligations outlived institutions. Debt survived empires. Britain emerged from this process not simply as a military victor, but as a system manager. Its influence stretched across the region through agreements, concessions, and inherited financial structures. Control did not always require direct rule. It required continuity. The continuity of trade flows, of repayment schedules, of access to resources. The old imperial capital faded, but the architecture of dependence remained intact. Vaults and contracts proved more durable than thrones. The Middle East that followed was not built on a blank slate. It was shaped by decisions made long before collapse became visible. Economic arrangements preceded political realities. New states inherited old obligations, or systems designed around servicing them. Fragile economies emerged not by accident, but by design. They were integrated into global markets in ways that prioritized extraction over resilience. Dependency did not end with the empire. It was redistributed. This is where the story reaches beyond the past. The Ottoman collapse is often taught as a tale of decline and backwardness, but that framing misses a point. The empire did not simply fall behind. It was outmaneuvered in a changing system of power. Military strength mattered less than financial leverage. Sovereignty mattered less than creditworthiness. Control shifted from those who govern land to those who govern flows of capital. Think about how modern this sounds. States today still borrow to buy time. They still modernize through external capital. They still pledge future revenue for present stability. The language has changed. The mechanisms remain. Debt does not need to destroy a state outright. It only needs to limit its choices. Once options disappear, outcomes follow. Collapse becomes a process, not an event. The Ottoman experience reveals a hard truth. Empires no longer fall only to armies at the gates. They fall to obligations they cannot escape. They fall when governance becomes secondary to repayment, when policy is shaped by confidence elsewhere rather than needs a home, when survival depends on satisfying systems beyond their control. This is not moral failure. It is structural vulnerability. There is no single villain in this story. The system rewarded patience, capital, and timing. Those who understood how to wait gained power. Those who needed immediate relief paid for it later. The tragedy lies in how invisible the shift was while it occurred. By the time consequences became undeniable, the architecture was already locked in place. Today, the echoes are everywhere. In contested borders, in fragile economies, in regions where resources generate wealth that rarely stays local. The map may look different, but the logic is familiar. Financial dependence reshapes politics. External leverage limits sovereignty. And once embedded, these systems are difficult to dismantle without disruption. The Ottoman Empire did not disappear because it lacked history or culture or ambition. It disappeared because the world changed how power worked. It entered a financial age without fully controlling its position within it. That lesson remains relevant. Power today is still exercised quietly, legally, and patiently. It still hides in agreements that seem reasonable at the time, and it still outlives flags and rulers. Remember this story not as a warning from the distant past, but as a pattern that continues to repeat. Because when debt replaces force as the main instrument of influence, domination becomes easier to deny and harder to resist. And the bill always comes due, even if the empire that signed it no longer exists. If you want to understand how power really moves through history and how economics shapes the rise and fall of empires, Subscribe to the channel. And if this story changed how you see the past and the present, share it with someone who should hear it too.